Alrighty then, back to critical thinking on the Zander channel with Chosen Nolen as your voice of critical thinking. So, moving on to chapter 15, we're going to get into some tools for critical thinking. So, critical thinking means not accepting ideas presented to us at their face value. The knowledge we get out of being educated will be nothing more than indoctrination if we cannot use it to think for ourselves. We all do have some ability to think critically. Critical thinking is the essential skill when we try to analyze an argument or try to compose an analytical paper. Logical thinking. What are the tools for critical thinking? College critical thinking courses teach a broad range of these topics, but nothing really on critical thinking. The topics are broad since to complete a complex critical thinking task, we will need various conceptual tools. The more tools we have at our disposal, the better problem solvers we will be. Yet, there are two platinum standards for critical thinking. There are logical and scientific thinking. Uncritical thinking violates the norms of logical and scientific thinking. Logical thinking is to reason correctly about the entailment relationship among ideas. An entailment relationship tells us if we know something is true. What else we can infer to be true from what we already know to be true. An entailment relationship can happen in two ways. One is necessary entailment, and the other is probabilistic entailment. Necessary entailment means that if all the premises are true, then the conclusion must be necessarily true. Probabilistic entailment means that if all of the premises are true, then the conclusion must likely be true also. Generally, the necessary entailment relationship is associated with the deductive logic, and the probabilistic entailment relationship is associated with inductive logic. So, when we say logical thinking, we mean either deductive or inductive logic. Deductive logic. You know that was going there. Deductive logic studies the necessary entailment relationship of an argument. In logic, an argument is defined as a set of sentences where one sentence is a conclusion and all the rest are premised or assumptions. Logicians or logicians, right, express the necessary entailment relationship with the concept of validity, which is defined as follows. An argument is valid if its conclusion must also be true. Whenever all of its premises are true, that's when your argument is valid, if your conclusion, in order for an argument to be valid, the conclusion must be true. Whenever all of its premises that lead to that conclusion are true. So, when an argument is valid, when all of its premises are true, it's logically impossible that the conclusion is false. So, when we say all men are mortal, which is true, Socrates is a man, which is also true, therefore Socrates is mortal. The conclusion is necessarily true since the argument is valid and all the premises are true. If a valid argument form contains a false premise, then the conclusion can be either true or it can be false. This is an example of a valid argument. It's a valid form of an argument with a false conclusion. All men are mortal. God is a man, which is false. Therefore, God is mortal, which is a false conclusion. Right? On the other hand, all men are mortal. A dog is a man, which is a false statement. Therefore, a dog is mortal. Here we have a true conclusion, but the truth of the conclusion is accidental and not necessary. It's not necessary at all. In an introduction to the logic course, students learn valid argument forms. So let's say the human is an animal. That's not necessarily true, but we lump it in that category in some scientific studies. So if a human is an animal and a dog is an animal, therefore human and dog are the same creature, and that's absolutely false. An introduction to the logic course of students, the students learn the valid argument forms. Thanks to validity, deductive logic is called truth preserving. That is, the truth of the premise provides a guarantee of the truth and the conclusion in a deductive and valid argument. That's deductive logic for you folks. Now we're moving on to inductive logic. Deductive logic is extremely limited in its application since it cannot create any new knowledge. The truth perceiving, the core property of the deductive logic, means that the truth of the conclusion of an argument is already embedded in the truth of its premise. In deductive logic, our knowledge does not extend beyond this premise. Frequently, however, we want an inference method that would allow us to obtain a new information that is not already embedded in the premises. We call such an inference ampliative, which is contrasted with being truth-preserving. An ampliative inference allows us to conclude by extrapolating available evidences or by extending more than what we already know. Since the conclusion is obtained without the truth-preserving inference methods, the conclusion may be false, and that can be warranted for the conclusion that is very likely to be true. Naturally, an ampliative inference method belongs to inductive logic. Examples of ampliative inference methods are generalization, casual inference, inference by analogy. An example of generalization that is form observing many black ravens, we infer that the ravens are black. From seeing smoke, inferring that it must be a fire is an example of causal inference. Newton's argument for the existence of God is an example of analogical inference. Newton believed that the universe works like a giant machine. Someone creates all machines. Therefore, the universe must have been created by someone. And these examples of inductive reasoning show there may be a non-black raven or a non-creator of the universe. Inductive logic is not truth-preserving. That is, the conclusion of inductive inference might turn out to be false. So now we move on to a statistical inference. Statistical inference methods are the most rigorous types of inductive inference. Unlike the above inductive methods of generalization, causation, and analogy, statistical inference methods come with mathematical rigor. The statistical inference aims to infer unknown population parameter values from the known sample data. For this purpose, in an Introduction to Statistics course, students learn 3 branch topics: probabilistic models of the world, summarization of sample data, and ampliative inference methods that are designed to address a specific purpose. Examples of probabilistic models of the world are the binomial distribution and the normal distribution. Examples of summarizations of the sample data are ways to express the central tendency and ways to express variabilities. Examples of amplificative inference methods are the Bayesian method and the hypothesis testing methods. The Bayesian method utilizes prior probabilities to obtain these posterior probabilities of hypotheses. The hypotheses testing method employs the idea of the degree of error inherent in accepting or rejecting a hypothesis. These two methods are rivals. Those espousing the Bayesian method are criticized for using prior probabilities, which are inevitably subjective. The Bayesian camp in response criticizes its rivals for the subjectivity in the error probability. The choice between error probabilities of 5% and 1% ultimately depends on personal preference. So some would accept a hypothesis while some others would reject that very same hypothesis despite sharing the same evidence, sheerly for the reason of erecting different error probabilities. Now, this is just a super brief sketch of the statistical inference, right? We don't have all year. The goal in introducing statistics as a case of inductive logic is to show that in academia, inductive logic is not clearly defined as a deductive logic and encompasses a broad range of topics that are viewed as amplificative reasonings. So, there's some errors on both sides, albeit very minor. But this goes back to your bias. This goes back to your core values. What evidence or what supports your core values and what supports your critical thinking, right? Not too much should ever support your critical thinking because you're always looking for new evidence. Scientific thinking is the other platinum standard for critical thinking. If logical thinking is about the proper relationship among ideas, scientific thinking is about the knowledge of the world. As science aims to understand the reality or the causal structure of this world, we often pass judgments based on what we think is scientific, right? The governments use this all the time. So, well, scientific data says this, so we're going to do that. Calling a view unscientific is often a sufficient ground to dismiss that view. Or, what is your background? What is your specialty? Are you a doctor? Are you something of some sort of professional? But what exactly does that mean? Well, we have some ideas. We think that predicting the future based on the outcome of a crystal ball reading is unscientific, but predicting the future based on the outcome of some data mining algorithm is scientific because a machine did it. Claims from a crystal ball reading are unscientific because they're unsystematic and unanalytic, and we don't know where they come from. There's no way to dissect the claims into theories and hypotheses and observables. So there is no way to test them through our machines. The hallmark of a scientific claim is testability. So because we don't have a machine to test the crystal ball theory, the scientific will dismiss that outright. For a claim to be scientific, we must be able to put it under a test. In other words, it can be proven to be true or proven to be false through these types of experiments, which always includes some sort of machine or some sort of chemical or some sort of methodology. For this reason, science is almost always involved with the experiments. But not all experiments are scientific. Suppose that someone argues that grasshoppers have ears in their legs. He explains how he found this out. He told a grasshopper to jump, and it did. He then took the legs off the grasshopper and repeated the same command. And this time the grasshopper, he didn't jump. So he reasoned that the reason the grasshopper did not jump is because he could not hear. So the grasshopper must have ears in their legs, right? We would not think that this experiment can serve as evidence for the claim that grasshoppers have ears in their legs to think scientifically. We need to know what makes an experiment scientific. So we got pathological science. In the history of science, we find that some experiments went down in history, while many other once celebrated experiments turned out to be hoaxes. To understand why, we are going to consider the so-called pathological science. This sciences are fields of study which the majority of scientists view as unscientific but remain popular among the general public. For this reason, it's also called pseudoscience or voodoo science or junk science. Examples of pathological sciences are horoscope and water dowsing, which aims to locate groundwater using a Y-shaped rod. One of the most publicized instances of pathological science is cold fusion. In March of 1989, renowned scientists Fleischmann and Pons announced that they had managed to generate heat through a fusion method at room temperature. This tabletop fusion experiment contradicted to going theories according to which generating heat in that way would require the force of a hydrogen bomb. If true, cold fusion would provide an inexhaustible supply of clean energy. Naturally, it caught the wildest imaginations of the general public. By the end of the year, however, cold fusion was almost given up. Scientists discovered that the experiment conducted by Fleischmann and Pons was fraught with defects. The observations, the measurements were not done properly, and the heat observed was obtained superfluously. The experiment was marred by the observational error and measurement error. The biggest objection to cold fusion was that no other researchers across the world were able to replicate the same experiment. Cold fusion was reduced to pathological science. So, we're not going to get into the other sciences there because we're coming to the end of the book. But for the purposes of critical thinking, well, I'll come to the conclusion there next. But comprehend that you need to go back and review the chapters. There's a lot of information in all of it. Hopefully you didn't binge the whole thing for critical thinking. And hopefully you'll actually go back and do that, do some more research in this book or the audio form of it and move forward in your life. So that is chapter 15. We will move on to the conclusion and the summary of the book, Critical Thinking.